everyone, and welcome to my channel. Today I'm back with another fall video. I'll be sharing 7 new fall decor DIYs that are super easy to create and affordable. I really hope that you all are enjoying all of my fall videos this year. If you are, please be sure to give this video a thumbs up and share it. Now let's go ahead and get started on today's projects. For the first DIY today, I'm going to be using one of these round signs from Dollar Tree. This one was from back in the summertime, and I am going to be using the back of this sign for the front of mine today. I peeled off that sticker and then I'm painting it with 2 coats of my Waverly chalk paint. For this project, I'm also using 11 of these unfinished wood leaves from Dollar Tree. All of them did have a pre-drilled hole in the very top, and I wanted to fill that in. So to do that, I'm using a little bit of wood filler. I just placed the filler on my finger and then pressed it into all of the holes on all of the leaves. And I did let that completely dry before sanding away any of the extra filler that had dried. I wanted to have a nice smooth surface for when I painted all of my leaves. For the first 3 leaves, I'm painting them with a color that I created. I mixed the color Tuscan Red, Vintage Mustard, and Java, all from Folk Art, to create this really deep burgundy color. And I really love the way that this color ended up looking at the end. Then I painted 3 more of the leaves with the Vintage Mustard color, also from Folk Art. And then I did 3 more leaves with a color called River Walk. And then for the last 2 leaves, I painted those with a color called Whispering Wheat. For all of the stems on my leaves, I painted all of them with the Java color from Folk Art. Then I wanted to add a little bit of detail to all of my leaves. So for the 3 that I painted with the Vintage Mustard color, I took a little bit of that Java color and I dry brushed it around all of the edges of the leaves, and then the paint that was left over on my brush, I just rubbed that around on the top surface just to give it kind of like a realistic leaf look. And then I did that same thing to the 2 leaves that were painted with the color Whispering Wheat. For the ones that were painted in this burgundy color and then also the Riverwalk color, I used hazelnut from Waverly, and I did that same thing. I just dry brushed that around all of the edges and then a little bit on the front of the leaves. I'm also using this Gather Wood word cutout, and this is from Joann Fabrics. I painted the entire word with the Java colored paint. Now that I have everything all painted, I can start assembling everything. I'm using the circle that I painted on the bottom, and then I'm placing all of my leaves around the edges of that circle. And I had the leaves overlapping each other a little bit, and I just spaced them out color-wise how I thought they looked nice. And then once I had it all planned out, and then I started hot gluing all of my leaves around the edges of my circle. And like I said, I did have them spaced to where some of the leaves were overlapping each other, so I would glue the one end of the leaf on top of the other, and then the other side of the leaf I would place down onto the actual circle. I hope that made sense. And then once I had those all glued around the edges, and then I just hot glued my Gather word right into the center. Then for the very last step, I need to attach a hanger, so I'm using some of this white cotton cord from Hobby Lobby, and I just cut it down to size and hot glued that on the back side. And here is my Gather wreath sign. It could be a sign or you could call it a wreath. It was super easy to create and it only cost me a few dollars, and I think it looks really high end. Now moving into the second DIY today. For this one, I'm using 4 of these unfinished wood frames. These did come from Hobby Lobby, and you can get them in a pretty large pack. I think it comes in a pack of 6. And I first started by just removing the backs from all of the frames. And then since I'm not going to be using the little hanger things that are on the sides of all of them, I just unscrewed them and removed them from all 4 of my frames. Then I'm using my Craft Smart wood stain in the color brown on an old towel to apply stain to all 4 of my frames. This is a water-based stain. I don't think Michael's makes this anymore, but you can find water-based stains at pretty much any hardware or craft store, or you could create your own with some paint. Then for the backs of all of the frames, I'm using my plaster color from Waverly. And then I'm also going to be using a couple of these wooden letters. These ones are from Joann Fabrics, and I'm using the letter F, LL, and then I used one of these unfinished wood leaves that I had in my craft stash, and obviously I'm spelling out the word fall. For the letters, I'm painting those all with the vintage mustard color from Folk Art. Then for the leaf, I'm using that same color that I just created in the last project, the Tuscan red, vintage mustard, and a little bit of Java mixed together to create this really pretty burgundy color. So I just painted one coat of that on the leaf. And then for the stem of the leaf, I just painted that with the Java colored paint. To add a little bit of detail to my leaf, I'm using a little bit of the hazelnut color from Waverly, and I'm dry brushing that around all of the outside edges of my leaf and then just a little bit along the front as well. Then it's time to place everything back together, so I'm putting the backs back into all of my frames. And then I wanted to start placing everything together to see how I wanted it before I started gluing it. You guys know I always like to do this because if I don't, then I end up making a mistake. So I'm just placing all of my letters and leaves in the center, and then I'm starting to hot glue each one of them down right in the center of all of my frames. Next, I'm gluing all of my frames together. I used hot glue on the sides of the frames F and the one with the leaf, and then just press them together. But to make sure that they will really stay together, I'm using some popsicle sticks on the back side just to make sure that they don't move around or come apart. And then I did the same thing for the other frames. I just hot glued the two sides together, and then I used some popsicle sticks on the back side just to ensure a really nice hold and for me to know that they are not going to fall apart. Then I wanted to add a different kind of hanger to this sign. I'm using some berry garland from Dollar Tree, and I use 2 strands of it. And at first I thought it was a good idea to use my staple gun to attach it to the back, but then I realized after doing so that my wood is way too thin and my staple went through the front of my F frame. So I ended up having to just touch that up with a little bit of paint, and you couldn't see where the hole was in the front. But since I couldn't use my staple gun, I ended up having to use some hot glue to attach the berry garland on the back. You just want to make sure that you're holding it in place until the glue completely sets, because if you don't, it will pop right off because this is a little bit of a heavier item. I did that to both sides, and that was the last step for this project. I think this one turned out super cute. I love all of the colors together, and it is a little bit different than anything I've recently seen. Moving right along into DIY number 3, for this one I'm using this Welcome Friends pumpkin standing sign from Dollar Tree. And I first started just by removing the sunflower and then the burlap part that was over top of the pumpkin, which I ended up not even really needing to do because I ended up using the back of the sign for the front of mine. And then I painted the front of the pumpkin with my vintage mustard color from Folk Art. I did have to do 2 coats of that paint. And then I did the stem of the pumpkin with my Java colored paint. And then I did want to add a little bit of distressing, so I used that same Java color around all of the edges of the pumpkin. And then I took the leftover paint that was on the brush and just very lightly painted that over the front of the pumpkin. Next, I'm going to be using this old sweater. This is, or was going to be donated, and I just decided to use it for crafting. So at first I thought I was going to cover the entire front of the pumpkin with a sweater and then have like a pumpkin cutout, but I ended up changing my mind. So here I'm just cutting the sweater down a little bit to the size that I'm going to want to place over top of my pumpkin. So I just cut the sleeve and ended up just cutting pretty much like a rectangle shape. Then once I had my sweater all cut out, it was time to start attaching it. So I just had it go across the very front of my pumpkin, and then I hot glued the 2 ends of the sweater along the back side. And I did pull the sweater so it was kind of tight along the front of the pumpkin. And again, just use the hot glue to attach it to the back side. Then I'm going to be using this really pretty yellow ribbon from Joann Fabrics, and I'm just cutting it down to size, and then I'm gluing that right in the center of the sweater going along the front of the pumpkin, and then hot gluing the 2 ends of that ribbon along the back side of the pumpkin right over top of the sweater. I'm also using this Give Thanks word cutout. This came from the Target dollar spot in a kit this year, but I'm just going to be using the word cutout for this project. And then I painted all of it with the Waverly paint and the color plaster. Once the paint was all dry, I then hot glued the word cutout in the center of my ribbon on top of my pumpkin. Then I wanted to add some details to the pumpkin. I'm using some of this like floral leaves from a Hobby Lobby pick that I got this year, and I just hot glued that right to the top underneath of the stem of the pumpkin, and then I added some of these mini pine cones that are from Dollar Tree, and then I used some more of this berry garland also from Dollar Tree. I just cut it down to a pretty small piece, and then I folded those or wrapped them around my finger to create kind of like a curly Q look, and then hot glued that underneath the pine cones. This is my Give Thanks pumpkin tabletop sign. This goes perfect with the colors that I'm using in my home for this fall, and it was, again, super easy to create this project. Now for the fourth DIY today. For this one, it's super easy. I'm using one of these wooden hanging pieces. This is from, I think, the Target dollar spot last year, but it has both a stained side and a white side to it. I'm using the white side for this project, and I'm also using this Gather Together stencil from Amazon, and I will have it linked down in the description box. So I'm just placing my stencil right over top of my wood, and it's pretty much the perfect size. Then to hold the stencil into place, I'm using some painter's tape around the two sides, and then also the top of the stencil as well, just so that it doesn't move around when I'm trying to paint. Then I'm going to be covering up the word gather in a few different places with my painter's tape. This is going to make sure that I don't get any of the color that I'm going to be painting the pumpkin onto the word, because I am going to be painting those two different colors, and this is just going to help me from having to do extra painting later on. So once I have the word gather covered up, or in all of the places that I might get paint covered up, then I'm starting to paint my pumpkin, and for the pumpkin color, I'm using the vintage mustard color once again. You guys know I love this color for fall, so I'm using it in a lot of my fall projects this year. And to paint it, I just used one of my Dollar Tree stencil brushes. After I had my pumpkin painted and the paint dried, I then removed the painter's tape from the word gather, and then you guessed it, I ended up using that same painter's tape or some of the little pieces, and I placed those over top of some of the places that I just painted the pumpkin, so that I didn't get any of the paint that I'm going to be painting my word gather onto the places that I already painted my pumpkin. Then for the stem of the pumpkin, I'm using the Java colored paint from Folk Art with a Dollar Tree stencil brush to apply the paint. And then I'm also using that same color for the words gather, and then also the word together at the bottom. Then for the vine that's at the very top of the stencil, I'm using the color Sage Shadow from Folk Art. Then I let all of my paint completely dry so that I didn't have any bleeding underneath of my stencil and onto my wood before I started removing all of the painter's tape and my stencil. For the last step in this project, I'm using some of this yellow ribbon from Joann Fabrics. I'm creating a really simple bow, and then I'm cutting the ends of that ribbon in a diagonal, and then I'm just hot gluing that on the top left-hand side of my sign. And here is my Gather Together sign all finished. This one is another super easy project that is perfect if you're looking for a last minute project that looks high end. Moving right along into DIY number 5, for this one I'm using this unfinished slatted wood pumpkin from Dollar Tree. And I first started by removing the jute hanger that's at the top of the pumpkin so that it would be a little bit easier for me to stain and paint the pumpkin. I am using my Craftsmart wood stain in the color brown to stain the two slats on the very edges of the pumpkin, and then I also use that same stain on the center slat of the pumpkin as well. Then for the other two slats of my pumpkin, I painted those with the vintage mustard paint color from Folk Art. I did do 2 coats of this paint. Then I wanted to add a little bit of distressing, so once all of that stain and paint was all dry, I used some of my plaster colored paint from Waverly on just like a stencil brush, and I very lightly dry brushed that color over top of the entire pumpkin to give it more of a rustic look. Next, I'm using these wood letters to spell out the word hello. These are either from Joann's, Michael's, or Hobby Lobby. I can't remember, but I'm just painting them all with the plaster color from Waverly. And then I'm also going to be using this pumpkin word cutout, and this is from Michael's this year. It did come in a pack that said hello pumpkin, but I didn't like the font that was on the hello word. It was a little bit different than this pumpkin word, so I ended up using the single letters along with this word cutout. And the pumpkin cutout I'm also painting with the plaster color. Then once that was all dry, I just started placing on my letters in the center just to get them all in place before I started gluing them down. And the same thing with my pumpkin word. And then to glue them down, I am using hot glue on the back side of each letter and also my pumpkin word. I found this really pretty ribbon at Joann Fabrics. It is perfect for fall. I'm creating a really simple bow with it, and then for the tail ends, I'm just cutting those off in a diagonal shape. And then before I add the bow, I'm adding some of this fall floral stems. This did come from one of those picks, and I just cut it off, and I'm hot gluing it at the bottom of my stem on my pumpkin. And then I'm also using one of these fall leaves that I cut off of one of my fall picks, and I'm just hot gluing that on, going in the opposite direction of the other florals on my pumpkin. And then it was time to hot glue my bow right in the center. For the last step in this project, I did need to add on a hanger, so I'm using this white cotton cord from Hobby Lobby, but I thought it would be a little bit different if I did it on the front. So I just cut my cotton cord down to size, and then I created a knot on each end of the cotton cord, and then instead of doing it on the back, I just hot glued that right over top of the pre-drilled holes in my pumpkin, and I think it added a really cute detail. And here is my Hello Pumpkin sign all finished. I really love the rustic look of this one, and it is super easy to do, just like the rest of the projects in today's video. Now for the 6 DIY today. For this one, I'm using 2 pieces of wood. These I did pick up from Lowe's, and they are 24 inches by 3.5 inches. And then I painted both of them with my Waverly paint in the color plaster, and I did 1 coat of paint on both pieces of wood. After the paint was all dry, I then used some hot glue on the sides of the pieces of wood and glued them together. Then to make sure that the wood pieces stay together, I used some popsicle sticks and I hot glued those along the back side of both pieces of wood. I'm also using this welcome word cutout from Joann Fabrics, and I'm painting it with the vintage mustard color from Folk Art. Next, I wanted to give my pieces of wood a distressed look, so I'm using some of my Java colored paint on a chip brush, and I'm dry brushing that color over top of my wood. Then I'm taking a piece of my burlap ribbon from Dollar Tree, and I'm cutting that down to size, and then fraying out the edges of the ribbon. I'm then taking that ribbon and placing it on the top of my pieces of wood, and then wrapping the edges around to the back side, and then using some hot glue to just glue those pieces down. Then I'm just placing my wood pieces, the welcome word, and then I'm also using these letters to spell out the word fall, and I'm just placing them on my sign to get them where I want them to be before I glue them down. These are from another sign that I had that fell apart, but I really liked them, so I'm just reusing them on my sign here. But you can find letters or single letters like this at pretty much any craft store, or even Walmart sells them. I just loved these, and they were already stained to the color that I wanted. So I got all of them all glued down, and then I'm using some of this berry garland from Dollar Tree, which you've seen me use in pretty much every fall video this year. I first started wrapping it around the very top of my sign, and I was using hot glue, and obviously the hot glue wasn't working, but this wood is thick enough that I can use my staple gun. So I just stapled the berry garland along the back side just to hold it into place so that it doesn't move around, and I wrapped it around in several different areas to where I thought it looked good. So there was no like special way of doing it. I just kept working with it until I thought it looked nice, and that was the last step for this project. And this is my welcome fall sign all finished. I ended up placing it on my front porch stacked on a hay bale, and it is just so simple and super cute with the rest of my outside fall decor. Now for the 7th and final DIY today. For this one, I'm going to be using 4 of these rectangle signs from Dollar Tree. 2 of them I think are from last year and 2 of them are from this year. And I'm going to start by painting 2 of them with the folk art chalk paint in the color Whispering Wheat. I did have to do 3 coats of this paint to get everything all covered up. Then for the remaining 2, I am doing this one with this burgundy color that I created. I used the color Tuscan Red with a little bit of Java and just a tiny bit of the vintage mustard color from Folk Art. I mixed those together to create this really pretty burgundy color, and I did 2 of the signs that color. Then I'm using this Grateful, Thankful, and Blessed word cutouts. These are from Hobby Lobby, and they do all come in one pack together. And I'm painting all of them with the Waverly paint in the color Plaster. Once all of my paint was dry, I then wanted to do a little bit of distressing. So for the ones that I painted with that Whispering Wheat color, I dry brushed the Java color over top of those to de-stress, and then the ones that are the burgundy color, I used my hazelnut color from Waverly and just dry brushed that over top. Next, I started attaching all 4 of my signs together. I did do every other color, and I used hot glue to attach them together. I just placed the glue on the bottom of each sign and pressed it against the other one until all 4 of them were attached. Then I just placed my words in the middle, kind of where I wanted them to be, so I could plan out how I want to do my ribbon. I ended up using some of this burlap ribbon from Dollar Tree, and then I cut it right down the middle to make them a little bit thinner, and then I did fray out the edges of the ribbon. Then I wanted to have them on each side, the right and the left side of my sign, so I just wrapped it around the front, and then I hot glued the edges of the ribbon along the back side of my sign, and I did this again for both sides. Next, it was time to attach all of my words, and I did want the sign to read Grateful, Thankful, Blessed, so I just placed them in order, and then to attach them, I used hot glue on the back side of each word and just made sure they were centered in the middle of my sign. To add a little bit of detail to the sides, I decided to use some more of this white cotton cord, and I just placed it right over top of my burlap ribbon in the center, and then I hot glued those end pieces around the back side, and again, I did that for both sides. Next, I'm using 3 of these wooden beads, and I'm painting them all with my Waverly chalk paint in the color Plaster. I only did 1 coat of this paint on them, and then I used my hot glue to attach all of them together once the paint was dry. This sign is going to be like a pumpkin, and these beads are going to be the stem. So I just hot glued those 3 beads that are glued together and the very top of my sign. And then I'm also using this really pretty leaf that came off of one of the Dollar Tree stems, and I'm just hot gluing that right next to the beads, and then I'm also using a little bit of Spanish moss around the beads at the bottom, and I just hot glued that on. Then I'm using some of this berry garland, which I've been using in every project. I cut a small piece off, made it into like a little curly cube piece, and I hot glued that next to my stem. And here is my Grateful, Thankful, Blessed pumpkin sign all finished. I love how all of these colors look together. It gives me that farmhouse rustic look that I love so much. I really hope that you enjoyed today's video and are enjoying all of my fall videos this year. If you are, please give this video a thumbs up and share it. If you're not subscribed, I hope that you will consider subscribing, and please be sure to hit the notification bell so that you don't miss out on any future videos. And please let me know in the comments down below which project was your favorite. Thank you so much for watching.